Welcome back. This is lesson number 5, and today we'll look at the two key elements of Hebrew poetry. First off, what's the difference between English and Hebrew poetry? The focus of English poetry that most of us are familiar with is on rhyme and meter. Now, rhyming is not absent from Hebrew poetry. The problem is we can't see it because it only exists in the original language. And the same is true for meter. The biggest difference between Hebrew and English poetry is that Hebrew poetry relies primarily on parallelism and figures of speech to emphasize meaning. So let's take a look at both of these. First up, parallelism. Hebrew poetry repeats and rearranges thoughts rather than sounds. The five most common types of parallelism are synonymous, antithetical, synthetic, climactic, and emblematic. So we'll take a quick look at each of these to help you recognize them. First up is synonymous. In synonymous parallelism, the thought of the first line is basically repeated with different words in the second line. So, for example, Psalm 2:4, he who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord holds them in derision. The second type of parallelism is antithetical. In antithetical parallelism, the thought of the first line is emphasized by a contrasting thought in the second line. And antithetical parallelism is often identified by the use of the word but. So, for example, Psalm 34:10, the young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. The third type of parallelism is synthetic. In synthetic parallelism, the second line explains or further develops the idea of the first line. So, for example, Psalm 95:3, for the Lord is a great God and a great king above all gods. Our fourth type of parallelism is climactic. In climactic parallelism, the second line repeats with the exception of the last terms. So, an example would be Psalm 29:1. Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. And our last form of common parallelism in Hebrew poetry is emblematic. In emblematic parallelism, one line conveys the main point, while the second line illuminates it by an image. So, for example, Psalm 42:1. As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. So that's parallelism and the five most common types: synonymous, antithetical, synthetic, climactic, and emblematic. Next up, let's take a look at Hebrew figures of speech. Hebrew poetry uses vivid images, similes, and metaphors and other rhetorical devices to communicate thoughts and feelings. The 10 most common we'll take a look at. First, simile. Now, a simile is a comparison between two things that resemble each other in some way, and the best way to spot a simile is through the use of the word like. So, for example, we have Psalm 1:3 and 4. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Next up in our figures of speech is the metaphor. The metaphor is a comparison in which one thing is likened to another without the use of a word of comparison like or as. So, for example, Psalm 91:4. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. Our next type of figure of speech is implication. The implication occurs when there's only an implied comparison between two things in which the name of one thing is used in place of the other. So, for example, Psalm 22:16. For gods encompass me, a company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and feet. The fourth type of figure of speech that's common in Hebrew poetry is hyperbole. And hyperbole is the use of exaggeration to stress a point. For example, Psalm 6:6. I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. Next in our figures of speech is paronomasia. Paronomasia refers to the use or repetition of words that are similar in sound but have a different meaning. And the difficulty with this figure of speech is, again, we could only see it if we can read the original Hebrew text. So, for example, Psalm 96:5 reads, for all the gods of the nations are idols. Well, the word for gods is Elohi, and the word for idols is Elohim. And so they sound alike, but they are referring to different things. The next figure of speech is pleonasm, and this involves the use of redundancy for the sake of emphasis. This may occur with the use of either words or whole sentences. So, for example, Psalm 20, verse 1, may the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. Here, the word name appears to be redundant. It has more emphasis than if only the term God had been used. The next figure of speech that's common is the rhetorical question, and that's the use of a question to confirm or deny a fact. So Psalm 35:10 is a good example. All my bones shall say, O Lord, who is like you, delivering the poor from him who is too strong for him, the poor and needy from him who robs him. Next in our figures of speech is metonymy. This occurs where one noun is used in place of another because of some relationship or type of resemblance that different objects might bear to one another. Psalm 5:9 is a good example. For there is no truth in their mouth, their inmost self is destruction, their throat is an open grave, they flatter with their tongue. Ninth in our list of figures of speech is anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is the assigning of some part of the human anatomy to God's person. So, for example, Psalm 10, verse 11. He says in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. And last in our list of 10 figures of speech common in Hebrew poetry is zoomorphism, and that's the assigning of some part of an animal to God's person to convey certain truths about God. So, for example, Psalm 17:8, keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings. Well, that's it for lesson number 5, the two key elements of Hebrew poetry, parallelism and figures of speech. I hope that looking at parallelism and the figures of speech will help you as you read the Psalms to identify their usage as you read and study along. Next up is our last lesson, lesson number 6, tips for reading and studying the Psalms.